type review, where the state board's review and performance of the public workshop and allowing for comment is limited to water segments that are timely listed or timely appealed from the regional board decision making, or other water segments that the state board elects to change on its own. And so the review at the state board level is already a fairly limited reviewing forum. Certainly not a full hearing is required under the current policy. So the delegation that exists in the proposed amendment then leaves intact the public participation requirements, but it just means that it doesn't have to be agendized for the full board's consideration if the circumstances warrant it and neither the executive director or board members elects otherwise.
So I have a question about just thinking about situations where there's some angst on the part of the stakeholder community. They could always appear to us by way of public comment at any point, or submit a letter. I mean, there's nothing to prohibit them from doing that, other than I'm wondering about, you're referring to a timely submittal. So where would that fit in? I think I understand with respect to the executive director and any access there, but what about in terms of the board?
At any point in time, a stakeholder may contact a board member or the executive director and urge that the state board open up the workshop for the board's consideration, rather than have it be limited with the executive director's review alone.
And the timely submittal
The timeliness, yeah.
Dee Dee, was the current listing policy. This isn't a change. The current policy says that once the regional board takes action, if the parties have concern about that action, they are supposed to appeal it to us within 30 days of that action for our review. So the policy actually does currently limit our review to timely submittals by folks who disagree with the regional boards, or where we review the list and say, you didn't quite follow the policy. And then those also go to full public comment at that time.
So the process in that situation is they'd still have to object within that 30-day period, and they preserve their rights at that point. The executive director may take months, but at some point within that process, if they're feeling that they'd rather it come before the board, they could at that point submit a letter or show up during public comment.
Absolutely.
And raise the issue.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So my question wasn't really answered about the scenario where the three regional boards during the cycle, one of them fails to meet their deadlines. We need to meet our deadlines to EPA. Our staff get involved.
In which case, then we have to do the full process that the regional boards would do and take it to you.
Right, and that's added in the language in 6.2. It says, such that consideration of adoption shall occur at the state water board, provide advance notice in the affected region, and for opportunity for public comment, and we would respond to all comments, not just that timely clause, and then we would take action for the regional board at the state water board.
Right. So so there would be. That's a good question, and the answer is that if we had to step in and do that work, we would have the full hearing here.
And it is similar to what Chair Marcus mentioned, that as to what this board has done in other cases, such as lack of a quorum at the regional board, where this board has taken up actions on behalf of the regional boards. So this is not a totally novel thing.
And it's important, I think, to point out that when, in fact, the state board did step in the shoes of a regional board and perform a hearing for their listing recommendations, that decision made by the state board on behalf of the regional board would be submitted directly to EPA along with the entire statewide list. So there wouldn't be reconsideration, so to speak, at the state board level when, in fact, the state board had already acted pursuant to a full hearing.
That would be interesting.
And it has happened. When the listing policy first was adopted, the first listing cycle was completely administered by the state board staff.
Mm-hmm.
So the very first one was done that way out after the policy was done, because it was too tight for the regional boards.
Is that the last time it was submitted in a timely manner to the
I think that one was late
USEPA?
too. It was also late, but it would have been even later if we had had to train the regions in the listing policy. So we took all the data ourselves since we had developed the methodologies, did it. The hearing was here, and then submitted, and then of course EPA has the final word on what's actually put on the list, and so there's also that public process as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sarah? Oh, there you go. You moved. Is that Coast Keeper Alliance, followed by Ricky Russell, also from the Coast Keeper Alliance.
Good afternoon, board members. Sarah Amanzada. I'm the Executive Director of California Coastkeeper Alliance. As you know, our waterkeeper organizations monitor and report changes to the health of their local waters, submit data to the state and regional water boards, advocate for the listing of impaired waters, and are involved in efforts to clean up those waters. As such, our groups and the watersheds that they protect stand to be deeply impacted by the proposed amendments to the Water Quality Control Policy for developing the Clean Water Act Section 303D list. And on a personal note, one of my first projects at CCK was to develop and execute statewide a series of workshops on the 303D process. I traveled throughout the state to remote areas of the Klamath and Humboldt, all the way down to San Diego, up and along the coast, to train groups on how to use the process and make use of it. I was, to Jonathan's point, one of the people urging folks to put aside the box of papers and enter stuff online, people that have been doing this work before the internet existed. So there's nobody that wants this process to work well, more so than me, arguably, with due respect to everyone here. I think I share the same perspective and goals as the State Water Board staff and members. I really want this process to be efficient and streamlined. So just a note on that. Unfortunately, though, I feel like the proposed amendments have some potential unintended consequences, and this was really something that came to our attention as we spoke with our local water keepers. I'm going to speak to the potential unintended consequences of the rotating basin process, and Ricky is going to speak to the seed-in changes. And then we also have Ben Pitterly here with Santa Barbara Channel Keeper, who can speak in more depth about the potential implications at the local level. And I just wanted to say at the outset, I think, too, that there was a little bit of a disconnect in speaking with board members and staff about the significance of this policy. I think most folks initially thought it was sort of a procedural sort of formality of decisions that had already been made and, you know, just changes to the way the policy is administered. But as we started speaking with our local groups who are collecting this data and have been advocating for 303D listings, we really saw that this was actually, from our perspective, some fairly large changes. And so that's what we're going to speak about. And did everybody receive the handout? Okay, good. So we're just going to go through this briefly. So the rotating basin process, as has been noted, is used in other states and is approved by EPA. However, you know, in effect, it will cause an 8-year delay between listing cycles. And even though that there is a process in place to submit data for off-listing regions, there's still some implications of this change. So, and I've just included a couple of examples here. One is that, for example, as monitoring results of TMDL implementation come up, the regional board may not receive those as soon and be able to either delist the water or adaptively manage the implementation of the TMDL. And this is something that San Diego Coastkeeper brought to our attention for their shipyard TMDL.
Why would they not receive it?
Just that they felt that that they wouldn't be able to submit data that might result in the delisting of that area. So that their monitoring results have shown that there's been a big improvement there in certain areas, and that they wouldn't have the opportunity to delist that water if their cycle, for example, or their region wasn't considered for 6 years, that there would be a delay in that. Understanding that there's always the option to, say, submit public comment or submit the letter. You know, from our perspective, the listing process and the data submission process is so plagued by delays that if there isn't sort of a standing agenda item for it or a regular process, that would even worsen under this scenario. We also felt like we didn't have a chance to sort of think through the process that was defined in this listing policy amendment for off-listing cycle data information. And that was one of the issues where we felt like we needed more time to talk with the regional boards, think through how it would actually work at the regional level. Another example that was brought to our attention is that there are funding decisions that are made based on impairments. For example, the Clean Beaches Initiative prioritizes funding based on impaired waters. And for example, this year, our Humboldt Baykeeper felt that some of the work that they were trying to do up in the North Coast wasn't considered for funding in the same way because they weren't considered impaired waters. So again, if their region was delayed, then this would delay decisions of that nature for 6 to 8 years. And then generally, given all of the changes that our waters are going through due to climate change, whether that's temperature or amount of flow, and then ocean acidification, these are some rapidly changing circumstances in our waters. And again, if we're only looking at certain areas every 8 years, changes could really mount and it could really become quite intense before we're able to acknowledge it. So these are the changes that were brought to our attention based on the rotating basin approach. And I just would like a little bit more time to talk through with board staff and our local groups about how we might address this and make sure that there's a process in place to address some of these local issues that might arise.
Yeah, I have a question for whoever wants to answer it. It's funny, as you were talking, various people were moving like they wanted to answer a question, so I don't even know who to. I'll let you all down there. I hate this room. Decide who's going to answer it. I mean, my impression was that staff was trying to respond to. There's the perfect being the enemy of the good here, right? So trying to do it all, it's overwhelming. We're not getting it done. This would improve things, but I thought I saw that they were open to changing listing on off cycle if someone made a case. So I'm sort of curious as to staff's review of the language you submitted. Sounds reasonable to me, so I'm just curious how staff responds to that, as opposed to having to spend a lot of time working through a process. The intention is that if we're in a situation where things are changing rapidly, and that it's not everywhere, sadly, from a delisting perspective in particular. But if you do find something that's rapid and obvious, it seems that we do have an ability to address it without dragging in everything else. So I would love staff's response to what you suggested here, which is kind of what I thought we were already saying.
Which I think we are.
Importantly, you're not precluding consideration.
We're not precluding, and I think one point that is hasn't really been made very well yet is one of the things about switching to the CEDN is that you're not necessarily limited to when we ask for data. CEDN can accept data continuously, and just like we do with SWAMP currently, our own SWAMP data, which is in the database, we then do a query over a period of time. So it's not like you have to wait 8 years to give us the data. You can give us the data at any time, and then if it is a rapidly changing situation, such as an appropriate delisting or appropriate listing, you can ask the regional board to take it up, or the regional board itself, especially when we're talking about things like the shipyard cleanup, which they're very active in. I can bet that they would want to, if they had success, trumpet that success.
Can I just... Sorry.
Okay, I'm imagining, how this would play out, because I know regional boards struggle with resources, and they'll say, look, we'll get to it when our cycle comes up. That could be a likely answer.
That could be.
And so in that scenario, do you see the state board staff taking it on through the review, potentially handling it through the executive director, and not having to go to the state board or coming to the state board? But there is a process where that might...
And the thing is, with the review cycle, the regional boards are going to be in the process of dealing with data for those years. They're not. It's not like we're taking away their staff for 6 years and then giving them back for 2. So they still have the resources we get through our federal EPA grants and our own funding to keep doing assessments. It's not like we're taking the assessment staff away.
That's an important point. So the work is getting done. It's not that this becomes a project in year 8 or whatever.
Right.
This is something that we have staff that we're paying for that are continually tuned to it.
Correct.
I hope so.
I certainly hope so too.
Because deadlines tend to drive those things.
Exactly.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it hasn't been working. I mean, that's the reason we're doing this, right?
I agree. I agree.
And so if the San Diego in particular, if that keeper group is worried about the new process, they must be really worried about the old one.
Well, yeah,
And so,
yeah.
it just seems to me that the old isn't working, so come on now, let's pull up our boots and
Yeah,
do
no,
do
I,
something that might
So-
work.
can I just
Yeah,
respond,
no, go
Jonathan?
ahead.
So my experience in working with local groups about the 303D process is that they feel intimidated by it mostly and confused. They feel it's sort of a big mountain to climb in general. And so our concern with the proposed changes to the policy is that they will feel that even more so if, for example, they feel they only have an opportunity once every 8 years to submit data. So, I think we sort of share the same position in that we want the program to work well. We agree that it's not working well as it is, but our concern and our comments here are really trying to alert the board to the fact that the local groups are feeling very taken aback and alarmed by it, and just that there hasn't been enough time to do outreach and consider these changes with the groups that will be affected. The policy was released on November 20th, I believe, and then response to comments on December 20th. So we were right over the holidays. People really felt like this came out of nowhere and they didn't have time to consider it. And I'm just really sort of a vehicle for those comments. These are the comments that we've been receiving not only from the water keepers, but from other folks. And so we're just giving a sample so that your inboxes and voicemails aren't flooded of the type of sort of alarmed comments that we are receiving.
Well, the thing I'm seeing in this, and everybody's got good intentions here, is just people are, of course, flagging what they fear.
Right.
And in fact, this could be much more useful, accessible, doable. So there's a communication issue in it that I see. But it actually does make sense. And I feel like we've been talking about this since I got here. So the proposal just went out, but I don't think this has been a buried secret in the
I don't think
board
it's
that we're thinking about doing it.
I don't think it's been a buried secret at the water board, but I can tell you, with some confidence that this is not something that citizen monitoring groups and others have known about widely. I mean, I sit on the Water Quality Monitoring Council. It's not something that we've discussed widely. And in our experience working on board policies, typically we have much more time to consider policies like this and sort of discuss different implications and discuss changes. And I mean, that's our perspective.
Right. I think generally that may be true more in the case where we're actually making a substantive change to something than a procedural change that's meant to get us to move faster in general to get things done. So I understand the point that you're trying to make. I have a question for the team, and if you want to think about it, and we'll come back to it at the end, your reaction to the suggested language, which is what I thought we were already saying. So
Yeah,
that would give people some comfort. That or some version of it is something I at least wouldn't object to putting
So
in,
I
but I
think
want to
that-
hear from you.
that Michael has some language to make sure it's clear. This might not be exactly the same language, but to facilitate. But I want to stress that the concept that that you have a series of data that you think either shows that there's an impairment or a delisting, and you put that together in a story for the regional boards of the state board, that's something that we would want to consider at every listing decision. The difference is what we normally get is a large amount of data that they say, now take
That's
this
not
and look at
actually
it.
useful, right.
That doesn't mean that if we get, I would never accuse the coastkeeper of this, but we get a series of edited data that only shows one outcome. We will look at all the data associated with that water body to make sure that it fits together. But I spend a lot of effort talking to our folks in our roundtables for TMDLs and assessment and basin planning, saying, hey, when you get the data that shows we've got either that a TMDL is working or it's not, we want to use that data. We don't want you to just put it in a box and wait forever. The other thing that I would say is that I know that we keep hearing, well, they'd have to wait 8 years. Well, they have to wait 8 years now. we're not getting these things reviewed.
Right, but
um,
our hope and expectation was that we would be moving in the opposite direction, not sort of formally saying, yes,
So give
we
us
will
less
never.
data.
Well,
I mean, it's really is a.
No, giving us less data or 4 times as much staff, which we're not going to get. So I mean, it's just not, that's not.
Right, and-
you can't squeeze blood from a
And just
stone.
to clarify, our position is not to formally oppose this change. We
You're just-
understand that the wheels are in motion. We want to work together to develop language that ensures that local groups have a process that they feel comfortable with, despite the different variations across the, real experience at the different regional boards. That's in some regional boards, what Jonathan and others have described may be perfectly easy and work seamlessly, but in others it may not. And so we just want to make sure that we take the time to talk with the local groups and make sure, okay, is what is written in this policy, does this sound feasible for you? Will this work in your region? And we just haven't had time to do that. I'm not proposing the adoption of the language in this handout. I'm just saying, can we work on language like that?
No, I appreciate that. I think a part of the question is, do we delay or do we go ahead and move forward with, we have time, with, a promise of a communication outreach discussion program and a report back to us in case we need to tweak this.
Right.
That's sort of the framing I'm.
And it's not just a promise. SEDEN has already scheduled outreach meetings with their users. And
No, I think that's great, but
so-
I do want
Yeah,
more of you at a senior level
right.
owning the relationship and the need to do that. Sometimes in some of our policies, like as poor Jonathan knows personally quite well, we've gone out more recently and spent a lot of time with people before we even propose a thing.
As I know
This had
personally.
not flagged for me something that would need that, and I'm not suggesting we do. I'm sort of inclined not to, especially since we have a time frame that allows us to do it afterwards and make adjustments if we need to, but it will need some senior relationship ownership.
Right.
But, and just, sorry, one last point. To,
Okay.
in terms of whether we make these adjustments before or after we adopt the policy, I would just submit that I feel that it's important that the regional boards have a really good understanding and buy-in of whatever that policy looks like before we adopt this, because it's not merely sort of a series of workshops around CEDN, it actually deals directly with, the process where folks can submit data. So that's,
The regional board, we confer with the regional boards monthly and bi-monthly with our roundtable, and they've been intricately involved with these amendments and what we've been proposing. So they are aware of it. And in the past, that communication might not have been very efficient, but since the adoption or the implementation of the roundtable, where we have active participation from all 9 regions and EPA, at least every 2 months, used to be every 1 month, to discuss what's happening with the integrated report, what pitfalls we find, what kind of solutions we're finding. So they are definitely on board with this. And I wanted to reiterate what Rick was saying, that CEDN is designed to solve the problems with using outdated data that would be collected every 6 years or 8 years, because it would allow any user to be inputting data real time into CEDN, so it would be built up on newer data over a long period of time, and then we would take a chunk of data that would be defined in the notice of solicitation from X date to Y date for every region, the whole state, and say, okay, we're going to do all the data for X, Y, and Z region, but all the other regions, here's the data. You should start assessing now, so when you're up, you can be ready to go bam and go, and as well as every region has high priority projects.
That would be so good to be able to go back and go, man. That
Right.
would really be good.
So and they all have priorities. Some that they want to show that their TMDLs are working. And so they're actually very excited about this. So.
All right, we'll come back, and thank you for that. Mr. Russell, let's talk more about CEDN. You can share your hopes and your fears.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to comment more on CEDN, which, just to start off, I'd like to further note that our large network of citizen science groups really do consider ourselves partners with the board towards really working to improve our waterways and document the impairments and issues we see. So our critiques of CEDN are really towards just improving a process that will work better for everyone, especially considering small, underfunded, or just groups with limited resources, which I think we can all kind of sympathize with in certain corners of the state as they try to, work towards meeting data requirements. And 2018 might seem soon, but with small groups with limited budgets and established protocols, or really working with a base of just volunteer scientists, that 2018 would come very quick for them and having to adjust to certain requirements. But again, overall, we are really largely supportive of the promises of SEED, especially with a move towards greater data transparency and the idea that the 303D listing process will become more efficient. So just to kind of point out some concerns with requiring CETA that we'd like to point out moving forward, some worries of ours would be, for instance, if we have a waterkeeper group that is collecting monitoring data for other purposes, we could think of maybe something that's attached to a grant, a restoration project, or even litigation. We would really like to see that data can also be submitted towards the 303D process, and we would want to make sure that requiring CETA format adjustments wouldn't preclude that. Furthermore, in the instance when we have a waterkeeper group that just might not have the staff or financial resources to meet CETA requirements, but otherwise has good data, we would want to make sure that their limited financial or staff resources wouldn't preclude them. Finally, we would really want to ensure that we would really like to ensure that there is comprehensive training for as we thank the board for already developing, and just really like to hammer home that point that we would really hope that the state board gets out and is able to do comprehensive outreach to citizen monitoring groups, not just Coastkeeper, but all the groups that are contributing to the monitoring and impairment process, to ensure that they're kind of able to be brought up to speed with these changes.
I mean, I think the intention, and again, I'm not an expert in this, the intention is, from my conversations, to make SEED not supposed to be an insurmountable burden. It's just supposed to be a way of getting data in that can be transferred. And so when you all are concerned about the formatting standards, I feel like, understandably, I'm not saying it's wrong, you're afraid it's going to be this nightmare of technology, as opposed to something where you could take something prepared for litigation or another grant. If it would meet those standards, I'm presuming it's the kind of thing you could get into SEED. If you could do that, you could translate it into SEED, and if it wasn't already automatically available. I think what it's trying to avoid are the boxes of stuff that we couldn't act on anyway for impairment. But I do have an asterisk thought of my own on that I need to ask as well.
Right.
But that's the intention. So I think the intentions are similar. The devil's in the details, because obviously folks are going to be concerned they're going to be frozen out, just as our folks are afraid they're going to be overwhelmed and paralyzed and unable to act. And so we're trying to find that sweet spot. Do I have that right?
Yes, and a lot of these citizen monitoring groups work with Eric Burris, who is our swamp coordinator for community monitor groups, and he's been training over the last several years to get these monitoring groups collect data within swamp protocols. Swamp protocols are actually much more stringent than CETA templates. They're very similar, and what all CETA really is it's requiring the data that you collect, which is normally inputted in a database, to contain certain fields, like longitude, latitude, where it's collected, the station name, what the analyte was, any sort of laboratory
Well, here's
quality
the problem. What's an analyte?
That's the pollutant that you're sampling.
Thank you. The
Right.
pollutant.
So
Okay.
it's if you're
See,
doing
that would scare me if
Right.
you said that in a meeting.
right,
know
but
what an analyte is.
I think the key point is a lot of, if you're collecting data for a grant, or if you're already one of the monitoring groups using the swamp protocols, this should be less onerous than doing what you're already doing. Likely you won't need as much information as you've already collected. It's designed to be non-cost prohibitive and actually allow that data that you are collecting by putting it into Seedon, be accessible by many different entities because it's a public database. Any researcher can go in there and pull that data and use it for all sorts of projects. So it actually makes that data more valuable and more widely
Right.
available.
Right.
And meeting with Seedon managers and their commitment to work with the groups and with Eric Burris in his work to provide that comprehensive training. We recognize that would be a necessary outgrowth, and they've committed to do that in the near future.
All
And
right.
this meeting in March is the first step towards that.
Right, but I am going to want somebody senior there who can translate analyte to pollutant and stuff. I have just been through too many processes at the local level with my own teams, not here, but at the local level where people talk past each other because they speak a different language. I want, if we're saying we're going to do this and we have assurance that we're going to actually make this workable, I want some senior management supervision of it, because very well-intended people who are very technical don't know when what they're saying is not understandable.
I totally agree with you, Chair Marcus. I've been in
You're a good translator, Rick.
right. I was going to say you need somebody who can translate computer Swahili through water quality Swahili to whatever, so that it actually makes sense. Because unfortunately, you're right. We do talk in alphabet soup and in archaic language that's there. And you're right. We do need somebody to translate. That is one of the functions of Eric Burris. That's
Okay.
one of the reasons we hired him years ago. Is he's also a very good translator.
Good.
And so I think that is the effort. The Seedon Group has, and Swamp has said that our assessment processes we are their number one client.
Mm-hmm.
It's also why initially Seedon was rolled out into regional data centers so that there would be localer people to help with the data. You know, you can't have somebody in every
See, now you're
watershed.
talking. That's really
So
yeah,
right.
localer. I get that.
Localer, but closer to where people are, so that it's, so there is a Central Valley data center that can work with the Central Valley people, for example. So even though we're bringing it in-house, from my talk with Rich Brewer and others, we still are planning that kind of ability to be able to have people not just sitting here in Sacramento to help, but people out in the field, at least in the regionals, folks to help.
No, that's actually helpful. I mean, the one place in this note, you would prefer a presumption that encourages submission in Seedon but not requiring it. I think I'd prefer requiring it and having an exception policy.
Well, I
Just
do
because
think,
otherwise they'll still get the boxes. And people will think those boxes are useful. That's the problem.
That
Is
is
that
the problem.
People submit things that they think are useful but actually aren't useful in making the kind of determinations that we're charged with making. And so we're trying to get closer.
well, the underlying theme really here is we do share the same goals, and we want to move away from the boxes as much as you do. We see a lot of advantages in the data transparency, and really are looking forward to that. It's just with our waterkeeper groups on any given day, we'll have someone monitoring an auto shredder yard or on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean doing a benthic study. And so we really feel we need time to really vet what these changes impose for each of these waterkeeper groups and their monitoring programs to bring before you any unintended consequences where we really do worry that some of this great data that our groups collect will be it will really impose a burden on them for them to submit it. And the last thing I think any of us want to see is to kind of have any of this data excluded.
Correct. And just to, again, reiterate the point Nick has made, the current policy requires swamp-compatible data to be submitted to us, and Seedon is
Is
actually easier than swamp-compatible. So if you're not submitting swamp-compatible data, we can't use it by the policy now.
Okay.
And we had situations in the current listing policy where I had to finally tell my staff, stop trying to get all the supporting data to complete the swamp piece because you're spinning your wheels after we've asked people 4 times. So unfortunately, it does happen right now that people submit data, and because it isn't swamp compatible, doesn't have QAPPs or whatever, the longs aren't usable. They don't tell us what the datum is, which is the type of that long. We end up not being able to use it, and we really want to be able to use the
And
data.
that's going to disappoint people more. So the
And-
point here is
exactly.
to come up with an intelligible framework. So you really are going to need to sit down with folks and come up with an intelligible framework that can help them, particularly the keepers, but others, translate to their members what it is that's
Right.
required. Because not everybody in every keeper organization is going to be able to come to a Seedon training. So
Correct.
it's got to be clear enough that the folks who come can work that through in conversation
Right.
with
And
us to be sure, because what I want a year from now, when I want you to come back and say how it's going before it has to happen, is people say we've worked it out and we're comfortable with it,
Right.
and happy, we share goals, and it'll work.
And to help facilitate that, one of the tools Eric Burris has used successfully, I believe, is to use the recorded webinar that doesn't require you to travel. You can either attend the webinar live or you can access it again. So he's
And
developed multiple tools
Right,
that
if
way.
you attend
and-
it live, you can ask questions and raise your hand on the thing, and if not, you'll have a limited number of questions to come talk to a person about later.
Correct.
Good. All right, well, we have more comments. We have 2 more comments I'd like to get through, and then we'll come back.
So before you move on, I just want to
Sure.
commit that we will have a high-level person to translate.
That's very good, and then you'll have a process, and you'll sit down, and everybody will be clear on it way before it ever has to go into implementation. Because that conversation is an important one to have. Just that we know it's going to work is only a piece of public policy. Public policy is also having the public understand, particularly the expert public that works with us, to understand and engage in how we shape it.
Correct, and we
So,
share that goal.
yeah. I would have rather done it before, but I'm okay personally doing it after. Next, we have Ben Pitterly from the Santa Barbara Channel Keeper, followed by Craig Johns from the Partnership for Sound Science in Environmental Policy. PSEP. That's not an acronym.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm Ben Pitterly. I'm the Watershed and Marine Program Director for Santa Barbara Channel Keeper. Our organization thought it was important for me to attend today as a group that has been doing long-term monitoring and as an individual has been managing long-term monitoring project for many years. We've been collecting ambient water quality data, kind of doing citizen monitoring since 2000. And I've been involved in managing that program since, for over 9 years. If you asked me, is Santa Barbara Channel Keeper going to be able to, comply with the requirement to submit our data via CEDA? I would say yes. I think, honestly, we can probably pull it off. But, I would also say that I think that we are perhaps an exception and not always the rule. Like I said, we are a robust program. I have the benefit of having a full-time assistant who manages our database, and she's like a whiz at pivot tables and doing this type of thing. She can manipulate fields and reformat. Many groups don't have that benefit. Particularly some of the smaller groups. But even for long-term monitoring groups, there are some challenges that I think maybe just should be considered. I just want to put those out, some examples out there for you. I keep hearing that, right, it's right that these requirements wouldn't be imposed until 2018, and so there's some time for groups to comply. But, our Channel Keepers monitoring project, we started, like I said, back in 2000. We actually started our monitoring project before they had adopted formal swamp requirements. Our database currently is, for the most part, consistent with the template that SWAMP recommends, but there are certain features that I'll speak to you that aren't exactly that. And it's important to point out that the data format, submitting it to CEDA, that's the final endpoint. Okay, there are many steps that go into monitoring before you get to that endpoint that you should think about. And maybe not the sampling itself will be altered that much, but for example, I've developed over a number of years a data processing system with my interns for when getting data from a data sheet into our existing database. And we have tools, we have Excel spreadsheets that do averaging and spit stuff out into a special format that fits our database format. To reformat that whole system would be significant. That's not, that's not a simple task.
Can I interrupt you just a second?
Sure.
So, because I think you're making a strong point. But is the data that you're talking about now that might not be consistent or might not be formatted properly, is that SWAMP compliant? That
Yeah.
data?
Okay, so
Even though
I've been
it's-
hearing swamp compatibility since I started working at Channel Keeper for almost a decade now. The state's been working on getting groups sort of reformatting their systems and making them swamp compatible for a long time. And I've actually participated. The Central Coast Water Board had a multi-year project where they were working with citizen monitoring groups to help us. They had their own system, right? It was a regional system that they were helping us manipulate our data to sort of fit into what it needed to be. Channel Keeper's data has been used now for 2 listing cycles. There are over 24 listings that cite Channel Keeper data as a primary line of evidence. One of the reasons it's complicated for us, we participate with other research groups. So the University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB runs our nutrient analysis, okay, and their lab has their own way of spitting out data, and we don't have the ability to change how they format and report their data. And so we've worked with the Central Coast Board, for example, to develop tools that will sort of reformat that into, into a system that they can work with. We never took the steps, right? We were working with them, and we didn't take the steps. I was aware of CEDN for a long time, but what we've been doing has worked, and we've been kind of participating in these processes for many years. Just another example of how reformatting our system would affect us. We have web tools, for example. I worked for 3 years or more with some volunteer experts who helped us develop a system on our website where it's a data portal, and it will plot our long-term data. It depends, the thing depends on our existing format. If we were to change that endpoint, how we store our data, we would have to redesign our entire web portal template.
I'm confused, though. It seems to me that what folks are asking for here is sort of a minimum level of data and formatting, not going, it's not like the issue we had with the Safe Drinking Water Program where data programs have to talk to each other. Everything has to be in the exact same format. It's some basic rules. So as I understand it, what you're hypothesizing isn't what's intended.
It's hard to, I think one of the challenges is when you're not delving into the details of like a database system, sometimes it's hard to envision all the little tweaks that you have to do, formatting tweaks, and it'd be difficult for me to get into specifics without kind of confusing you, but it has to do, some of our fields are rows the way UCSB gives them to us, and so we have to retweak that every time we want to submit something into a particular format. Now, I'd point out that every time, we've taken pains with our data processing system to minimize tweaking and reformatting, right? Because that's one of our primary challenges with QA/QC is because every time that you have to do that, you insert the possibility of error. That happens all the time. So I think for groups that are starting a program now, it probably is relatively simple, and it's a good idea for them to design their program to fit into the CEDN. For groups like us who've been around for a long time, we've sort of developed tools and ways of doing things. We're not submitting boxes. It's nothing like that. It's actually, it's usable data.
The intention's not going to be to exclude that stuff. So what do you say, any of you,
So
to give him comfort?
Oh, I can't give him any comfort. I think he's exactly right.
Okay.
That every time you work with a database, every database has its own unique set of characteristics, and you want to submit data to another system, it has to be formatted.
Okay.
There's just no other way around it. The question really is, because today, essentially what he's saying, and I don't mean to be argumentative, is that we should take all the people's different format systems and do that tweaking ourselves. Because somebody has to. It has to be,
amount of work.
yeah, it
Thank you,
has to
that's
be
right.
put into a system. Now, some of that can be done automatically, some of it can be done by setting up CEDN that way, but in the end, everyone's unique data system has to be translated into a standard format so that you can do statewide assessments. I understand that we'd be putting a burden on some folks to do that with their data systems. And we haven't in the past really imposed that burden in the past. We've done that burden ourselves, and we have not been very successful with it.
I might, if I
All
could, I
right,
just
and
provide.
then I am going to move to the next speaker because we could talk about this all day.
I would just provide one additional example. Again, UC
Yeah.
Santa Barbara, they have their long-term ecological research project. They've
Right.
done our nutrient analysis. They themselves, though, have been collecting data from dozens of sites for almost as long as we have.
Right.
That program wasn't designed with the function of submitting data to for the purposes of 303D assessment. For that to happen, I can sort of bug them to do that. I mean, really, the only way for that data to be considered, it's high-quality data, the only way for that to be considered would be for us to take on that burden. And I wonder if that's just, one example of many of available data sets where there isn't maybe there isn't a group that has the resources to sort of shepherd that manipulation, that maybe there is still a role for the state to accept.
Right.
But
No,
s-
I
those
get
data sets.
that, and so that's the exception point. So that's the other wing of the exception point. One is the simpler stuff, and the other is the more complicated stuff. But we can't end up in a situation like we are now where it's odds and ends for 20.
Yeah.
And
So then that's
we're
where I
not
would,
getting that overall benefit of having a system that is more transparent in general.
I would
Sure, but
concur
that's
with
interesting.
our coastkeeper partners then in just recommending perhaps a little bit more time be taken to identify some of the situations that conflicts or unintended consequences might arise.
But by taking more time for us to make a decision to move forward with training and identification
into
of problems, I don't see how you're going back to the keepers or to others and having that conversation separate from working with staff on working out the problems. I don't get the advantage of more time for you to talk among yourselves and get all worked up about this. Really, we need to get about the business of getting the data into the system. We've got 3 years. Sounds like we got a lot of work to do. So let's get started. I mean, I just don't get it.
And I might add one just clarifying point that we do give ourselves is that in the solicitation memo, we further define all these things so that if we do run into a situation such as, this data type can't go into CEDN, which is already one of the outs, as you would say, or one of the
Right.
exceptions, in the solicitation memo, then we can identify and say, okay, this data we recognize can't go into CEDN for whatever reason. Here's the format we need it in, and here's the QA
So
requirements.
then you would come up with an appropriate,
Right. So we do have on the solicitation cycle itself the ability, as we run into an issue, to address it via the solicitation memo.
right, but it'd be nice to have the conversation
Oh,
that some of our
absolutely.
colleagues want to have. I'd like to see it sort of framed out now, and I'd like you to figure out how to deal with TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. That's not going to fit into anybody's formatting,
Nope.
but it's relevant.
I agree.
So that's something I want you to figure out how to do. And you're not going to say, here's how you get it in CEDNs, because people won't give it to you. Again, there's a limit to how we can use it if it's not in a format, but clearly I can envision impaired water bodies where that historical ecological knowledge is going to inform whether it's impaired or not, because you're going to hear about what it was.
Absolutely. And that
Do we
that
have a provision for that in there
well,
now?
well, that is one of the exceptions already.
Okay, good.
So we recognize
Sorry, I
that
missed
things like I would consider that information to a certain extent versus hard data, because as you say, it's the sort of historical ecology kind of information. We can accept that information now. We can accept it under the amendments. It takes us more work, yes, but we can still accept it. We're not saying we wouldn't accept that, because it's not a type of data that CEDN can handle, right?
So I can envision you being able to come up with a few parameters in conversation afterwards for the type of data that you would emphasize trying to figure out how to bring in information data, that even if it doesn't fit in CEDNs, and then just spelling that out a little bit more. I think
It's
will give people
exactly what
comfort.
we've been doing with photographic evidence since the policy was adopted, is saying, okay, if you're going to submit photos, they need to have this minimum set of information to accompany the photos.
Right,
So I
and
see it
sometimes
the same way.
historical ones, you're not going to be able to.
Right, but you
accept it.
should be able to hopefully get, the watershed, right? If we don't have the
Right.
watershed, we can't do anything.
That would be helpful, yes, for example. All right, that's all helpful. I'm going to go to the last
Is it-
speaker. Thank you, that was very helpful.
Is there any way I could just make 2 quick points? I don't get up here too often.
If they're quick, if they're not,
I promise
you
they'll be
know,
quick.
You'll never get another extension of time. again.
Okay, I promise I'll make these quick. Just with regard to the cycles, I just thought, you know, I've seen citizen monitoring groups come and go within an 8-year period, within a 2-year period. The data solicitation, if that's only happening regionally on an 8-year cycle, it could very well be that there's data being collected in a format that's seeding compatible, that by the time year 8 comes around, there's nobody there.
No, that's right, so you can
To-
submit at any time, you don't have to wait for a solicitation. That's already been said
Yeah,
today.
back
So
in-
we don't submit, I mean, I've submitted my data to the state multiple times, but we wait for the data solicitation. It's not something that groups typically do on an ongoing basis.
No, but they could, but to solve your problem, we'd have to do it every 2 years like we're supposed to, and that's an impossibility. You're
Well, I was
right,
just
in
speaking to
theory,
data
but it's just
solicitations,
impossible.
Right,
maybe.
and
So
the
we're
data
bringing it to
solicitation would be
real-time.
every 2 years.
This is more of a
too.
real-time program now, is what's proposed. It's not an 8-year solicitation. This is enter the data in, it's continuous. It's more what citizen groups need.
Okay.
Right,
And then
and-
when we would list would be on that cycle.
Right, and as Nick clarified, when we would send out the solicitation letter, just as sort of a reminder